Welcome back to Pod Save the World. I'm Tommy Vietor.
I'm Ben Rhodes.
Let's talk about the 2020 election and the latest news about efforts to influence it from bad actors abroad. So the ODNI, the Director of National Intelligence's office, just released this report. Here's some of what they found. Importantly, there's no evidence, or they found no evidence, that a foreign actor tried to mess with the voting processes themselves, right? There's no evidence someone tried to switch votes from Trump to Biden or Biden to Trump, or to mess with voter registration, stuff like that. So that's good. But the intelligence community does believe with high confidence that Russian President Vladimir Putin authorized a whole bunch of propaganda efforts designed to denigrate Joe Biden, to denigrate Democrats generally, to prop up Trump, and then undercut the political process generally. Russia did this through a network of useful idiots, basically, in the U.S. media and prominent political figures, some of whom were close to Trump. The report names Konstantin Kilimnik, who is a former staffer for Paul Manafort, also linked to Russian intelligence, and it names a Ukrainian politician as people who specifically laundered Russian disinformation to the U.S. media, presumably places like OAN, and to idiots like Rudy Giuliani. The report also says that Iran carried out a covert influence campaign to denigrate Trump and to undercut public confidence in the electoral process. They also found smaller scale efforts by other groups that weren't really significant sounding. Oddly, to me at least, Ben, the report says that China did not try to influence the election. I thought that was curious that they mentioned that. I don't know, Ben, I felt like we knew most of this, but did anything jump out at you from this report?
No, I mean, I think we knew most of this. I do think that, the couple notable things are, it's like normal now that this happens, right? Like This would have been like a blockbuster thing in 2012, right? But after 2016 and 2020, the idea that Russia tries to influence our election and mounts these kind of information warfare campaigns, that's what happens. And again, I think that the main message here is less, the genius nature of some Russian troll farm and more the willing nature, whether because they're idiots or whether because they don't really care about American democracy, the right-wing media and political figures, including people in like the United States Senate, like Ron Johnson, who was basing whole investigations on Russian disinformation. Mm-hmm. It's like normal. It's not even going to make a ripple, I think, in our political discourse that the Republican Party and people around Trump were like willing collaborators with Russian disinformation. And again, it doesn't really matter if they knew that they were talking to like a Russian spy. They clearly knew that a lot of this information was bullshit, and they ran with it anyway. So to protect ourselves against Russian disinformation, it's not about like going to war with Russia. It's about not having insane conspiracy theories that drive our political and media discussion. That's something we have to do at home,
Yeah, the trolling is coming from inside the house, guys. This is a symbiotic relationship between Russian intel and the Republican Party in many instances.
Exactly.
Not ideal. Okay, well, we dispatched with that quickly. Let's talk COVID, because I imagine all of us were excited last week when President Biden announced that he was directing states to make all adults eligible to get a COVID vaccine by May 1st. Now, Biden is able to do that because the Trump administration pre-purchased a bunch of different COVID vaccines as part of Operation Warp Speed, even before they were approved by the FDA. And the Biden administration has done a really great job of ramping up that process and distributing those shots to people in states. But vaccines are scarce, right? And many countries, especially poorer countries, haven't been able to get enough doses for their population. It's not even close. And that's bad for the people in these countries. It's also bad for us in America because the more COVID spreads, the more it mutates, and it can put us at risk again. So the whole world needs to get vaccinated. And the question is, how do we do that? So one important part of the piece of the puzzle is called COVAX, which is a global coalition working to distribute doses to lower income countries. There's another debate about whether the U.S. should be sending some of its surplus doses overseas because we purchase way too many. But then there's another idea that is really not getting discussed enough, which is this request from 57 countries to the World Trade Organization to temporarily waive patent protections for COVID vaccines. So Bernie Sanders sent a letter to President Biden asking that he come out in favor of this proposal. On the House side, I saw Reps Jan Schakowsky, Rosa DeLauro, Earl Blumenauer. They sent a similar letter in support of temporarily lifting certain restrictions on the manufacturing of like COVID-related diagnostics, treatments, vaccines. Ben, I don't have a clue how vaccine manufacturing works. But oddly enough, like this is what you and I have been talking about on this show for months. Clearly, the world would benefit from essentially open sourcing everything we know about COVID, as well as the ways we can stop it. It seems like a no-brainer to me. What do you think is holding this up? Is this just like lobbying from pharma? Like, what's the impediment here?
Well, I think it's a no-brainer. From a humanitarian perspective and a global public health perspective, you want as many people to get as vaccinated in as many places as possible, as fast as possible. If you want to advance that to self-interest too, by the way, the U.S. standing in the world, let's just say it's taken a bit of a hit over the last few years.
Fair.
What better way to try to, Joe Biden keeps saying America is back, and that's great. But like, what better way to actually demonstrate that than to have America lead the world in getting billions of people vaccinated? We have the resources, we have the innovation here to having created a bunch of the vaccines in this country to make that happen much faster than it would otherwise. So I think it's a no-brainer. I think there's two potential constraints, right? One is the perception that America is helping to vaccinate people in other countries, particularly maybe before everybody in America has been vaccinated. But look, as long as Joe Biden knows that the vaccine is not being slowed down and reaching Americans through some effort to reach people globally, I think you can make that case that, this is not some America first ideology administration. This is an administration that sees our fates as tied together with people around the world. And no, we're not going to slow down at all getting the vaccines to as many Americans as fast as we can, but we can move on a parallel track to get the vaccine disseminated globally as well. And then secondly, I'm sure that there's some, profit motive in big pharma or some precedent that they don't want to set. But this is an unprecedented thing. This is a once in a century global public health emergency pandemic. Just bulldoze right over those concerns. And there has to be ways, I'm sure that the pharma companies are being compensated for all the vaccines that are being purchased to begin with. This is one of those cases where there's just a right thing to do. And so you figure out a way to do it. And by the way, doing the right thing, I think, will go a long way towards the United States once again putting itself forward as a country that is a leader in the world, not just because we say we are, but because of the things that we do.
Yeah, God forbid we set a precedent that everyone has access to medications that are life and death in the middle of a pandemic, right? Yeah, I mean, I can understand the concern about, look, we bought 2 or 3 times more vaccines than we needed, doses than we needed. I could see how easily it could be demagogued if Republicans were to say, oh, Joe Biden's sending your vaccine overseas, that's why you can't get one yet. Sure. But that's not even what this proposal is. They're saying let manufacturers in South Africa or India or other places make the vaccines by lifting restrictions on the intellectual property. Again, I don't know what it takes to manufacture an mRNA-based vaccine. I don't know if these countries could do it, but it seems like an idea we should consider. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I think we absolutely should, pursue that idea, frankly. But even on the surplus vaccines, right? You don't live in fear of those arguments, those kind of America first arguments, as long as you know that you are doing everything you can to if an American wants the vaccine, you're moving it as fast as possible to reach that American arm. There's no reason we have to toss out a huge amount of surplus vaccines because we're afraid of, or sit on them because we're afraid of the perception that people in other countries might get them. I mean, we have to break out of that psychology here, and there's a real opportunity on both these scores. And on the second one, it's funny. I was talking to a British friend who was watching the Meghan and Harry interview and was jarred because she doesn't usually watch American television by the fact that all the ads were for drugs, basically. Oh yeah. Because they have socialized medicine there, right? So the idea that there's something already uncomfortable about the profit motive attached to life-saving drugs in this country. Yeah. I get it. We don't have socialized medicine, okay, but for a pandemic that is killing people, that is putting the global economy at risk and global supply chains and the capacity for Americans to travel to places, there are plenty of self-interested reasons. If you don't buy into the kind of global humanitarian argument, which I think we do, You can mount plenty of self-interested reasons around American standing, around the global economy, around the capacity for Americans to be safe in other places, that you'd want to get as much vaccine to as many places as fast as possible. And this feels like a very good idea to do that.
Yeah, and also just so listeners know, I mean, this isn't a challenge just for low-income countries. Europe is in a really tough spot right now because a bunch of the countries in Europe, Spain, France, Italy, have stopped vaccinating people with the AstraZeneca vaccine because of fears about that it might potentially be creating blood clots. Hopefully they sort that out quickly, but a lot of places are way behind us. Cases are spiking, so we got to move on this. Ben, you want to talk about Jared Kushner for just a little bit? I think it would be fun.
National treasure.
National treasure. Let's give them what they want. Okay, so apparently he's writing a book about working in the Trump White House and why Jared thinks that he is a hero for negotiating peace agreements between Israel and countries that they were not at war with. Of course, I'm talking about the so-called Abraham Accords. Jared must now have a ghostwriter on retainer because he started publishing op-eds. This one was in the Wall Street Journal. So I figured we could go through some of the quotes and just talk about his genius. So this is how it starts. The geopolitical earthquake that began with the Abraham Accords hasn't ended. ... We are witnessing the last vestiges of what has been known as the Arab-Israeli conflict. Quite a bold statement there, Ben. Let's see what evidence he has to back that up. Quote, every time Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu tweets something positive in Arabic about an Arab leader, it reinforces that Israel is rooting for the success of the Arab world. Does it? Okay. Okay. Good to know.
It reinforces the fact that they're rooting for the success of a small number of Arab autocrats who are brutally repressing their own people and cynically turning their backs on the Palestinians. But I digress.
No, look, fair. Here's another big block quote, and then we'll just pause for discussion. One of the reasons the Arab-Israeli conflict persisted for so long was the myth that it could be solved only after Israel and the Palestinians resolved their differences. That was never true. The Abraham Accords exposed the conflict as nothing more than a real estate dispute between Israelis and Palestinians that need not hold up Israel's relations with the broader Arab world. It will ultimately be resolved when both sides agree on an arbitrary boundary line. Ben, let's pause there. Can you think of a more condescending way to refer to the desire for the Palestinian people to have a state besides calling it a real estate dispute? I mean, that is mind-boggling.
Yes. Imagine being Palestinian and your entire national identity, your entire individual identity, your experience of occupation or life in a refugee camp has been shaped by this conflict. And then some guy who's like the scion of a synonym for crooked real estate family from New Jersey, whose main experience in life was buying the New York Observer for his own edification and entry into certain New York media social circles, somehow becomes the second most important person in the United States, and then tells you that your whole identity is essentially a real estate deal. It's basically akin to the kind of real estate deals he was probably in, where you displace people to make way for a gaudy and ugly skyscraper, paying them no compensation, and then telling them that life is just one big real estate deal. I mean, it's a metaphor for how he approached the whole thing, which is this is a conflict in which the Palestinians just need to be dictated to what their terms of surrender are. And then, he has to be celebrated as a peacemaker,
Just incredible. Yeah. A real estate deal that has also impacted a lot of Israeli lives as well. But, look, Jared read a Tom Friedman book on the flight over to Tel Aviv. So, he learned something. So Jared takes like a little odd swerve in this op-ed. He then writes, quote, the Biden administration is making China a priority in its foreign policy, and rightly so. One of Mr. Trump's greatest legacies will be changing the world's view of China's behavior. Apparently, America found China when Donald Trump got into office. But then Jared gets to the Iran deal. So I'm going to read another long quote and see what you think about this. The Biden administration, however, has one asset that the Trump administration never had, a relationship with Iran. While many were troubled by the Biden team's opening offer to work with Europe and rejoin the Iran deal, known as the JCPOA, I saw it as a smart diplomatic move. The Biden administration called Iran's bluff. It revealed to the Europeans that the JCPOA is dead and only a new framework can bring stability for the future. When Iran asked for a reward merely for initiating negotiations, President Biden did the right thing and refused. So, Jared thinks he's being cute here, right? He's pretending to compliment Biden, but really what he's advocating for is abandoning the entire Iran deal and making it exponentially more complicated. Ben, do you like this advice? Do you think maybe Biden should have him into the Oval for a chat, get his advice?
I mean, again, like, first of all, there's so many, this guy, like, okay, nobody was aware that the Chinese Communist Party had some complications until Donald Trump came along and launched a trade war to get them to buy some more soybeans while devastating huge sectors of the American economy at the same time, right? In the same way that it had occurred to nobody before that you would try to make normalization deals between Israel and its Arab neighbors. And it does matter that this guy is an odious character who contributed to the death of 500,000 Americans and the near death of American democracy. I mean, if he's wrong about all those other things, it may be worth, subjecting his opinions on these matters to a bit of scrutiny here, because what he's trying to do is he's trying to launder his reputation, which is, belongs in the complete garbage dump of history, through like a handful of normalization deals that he basically purchased with arms, with the Emiratis and with Bahrain, and this tough on China stance that is now like in vogue across like the political spectrum, so that he can somehow come out on the other end of the historical accounting of the Trump years as like a thinker, as like a junior Henry Kissinger here,
yep.
right?
Yep.
And like that's fucking bullshit. But it shows you cynically how much he thinks that's going to work. And you know what? He might be right, because look at the response to the Abraham Accords. Like, look at like how much everybody's rushing to define themselves in the most hawkish possible terms on China, without even pausing to consider nuance along the way. I think on the JCPOA, if I were the Biden people, I would wonder why Jared Kushner is praising my policy at this point.
That would bug me out too.
It would bum me out, because I think he sees the writing on the wall, which is that the Biden people appear tentative to re-enter the JCPOA, and he wants to set up a framework wherein he can say, well, look, they decided that all this leverage we gave them with our sanctions and decision to leave the JCPOA was better than returning to the nuclear deal, which had actually solved the problem here. And so I would actually take this in the Biden White House as a shining, blinking red light that maybe what I'm doing is not right, because Jared Kushner is finding words to praise it.
Yeah, this is a PDB on George W. Bush's desk in August of 2001. So remember, before we were a little hard on Joe Biden for not punishing Mohammed bin Salman himself, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, in any way for the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, Washington Post journalist. Jared Kushner was the person actively covering that up, right? So Joe Biden, they put out the fact that MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, was directly responsible for Khashoggi's murder. Jared Kushner was WhatsApping the guy all day long, apparently, according to reports. So later in this op-ed, Jared starts to shill for the Saudis, surprise, surprise. And he writes, normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel is in sight. Relations with Israel are in the Saudi national interest and can be achieved if the Biden administration leads. So again, I don't think anyone's arguing against some sort of the fact that normalization between the Saudis and Israel would be good, but it does seem like he's dangling it out there in an attempt to get the Biden folks to overlook all the other terrible things the Saudis are doing, both to Khashoggi and in Yemen, et cetera, et cetera.
And this, again, this is the whole problem, that we identify with the Abraham Accords to begin with. It's not that we think normalization between Israel and Arab states is anything but a good thing on its face. The question is, to what end is that being put, right? And to me, it seems like, whether you're Mohammed bin Salman in particular in Saudi Arabia, or you're, the royal family that governs the UAE or Bahrain, it's being put to reinforcing their autocratic rule, to getting tens of billions of dollars in arms, which was promised as a part of the Abraham Accords. And by the way, to also fortifying the Israeli right, because, it's a win for Netanyahu, in a way that, yes, you accomplished something that people wanted, which is normalization, but is it worth legitimizing Mohammed bin Salman for that goal? Isn't there a better way of making peace than this kind of get out of jail free card, literally, for a guy who chopped up somebody in a consulate? So it's not subtle. What Jared's doing here is not subtle in carrying MBS's brief and saying, the Abraham Accords don't happen without this guy. And the next one could be the Saudis. But I'm sure that the price of the next one is, no scrutiny of those arms sales to Saudi Arabia, no scrutiny of aspects of Saudi foreign or domestic policy here. And is it worth a normalization deal with Israel to do that from Mohammed bin Salman? I don't think so, in part because I think that for a normalization deal to be meaningful and lasting, you have to make peace not just with autocrats, but with the people in those countries. True peace has to be among not just a handful of right-wing leaders. It has to be amongst the people who live in Israel and the people who live in the Arab world. And, I worry about this. And I also want to see what kind of business Jared is going to be doing with Mohammed bin Salman in the years to come.
Oh yeah, me too.
You already saw Steve Mnuchin, launch some kind of investment venture capital fund or something in the Gulf.
Well, he's got to be able to afford his wife's movies that he's bankrolling.
How do you think those pieces of garbage get made? So, I mean, like watch this space of what Jared is going to be doing with MBS. Cause American foreign policy shouldn't be for sale. The quote unquote peace should not be put up for sale. Nor should the capacity of an autocrat to act with total impunity, which is what MBS wants. And I think the play here has been to basically launder the Gulf out of the penalty box that they felt themselves getting in with the Democratic Party, launder MBS out, get Jared a pathway to the most lucrative arrangement he could have post-Trump presidency with MBS. And, lo and behold, the Palestinians get screwed. I think the Israelis don't get the true peace that they deserve. And people who live in Saudi Arabia certainly don't get the freedoms that we would want for them either.
Well, listen, we're grateful that Jared stopped the bloodshed in the ongoing Israel-Morocco war with the Abraham Accords. And, listen, our commitment to you, the listener, is that we will read things written by Jared Kushner so that you don't have to. And you don't have to give the Wall Street Journal a click.
The good news, Tommy, is that by the summer, this country should really be rocking. It's just the summer of 2021, not the summer of 2020.
Yeah, another great Jared Kushner quote. Okay, let's turn to Asia because there's a lot going on, especially with North Korea. So Reuters reported over the weekend that Biden's team has tried to initiate talks with North Korea. They did so in mid-February, but the North has not responded. This news leaked just before Secretary of State Tony Blinken and Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin hit the road. They're traveling to Japan and South Korea for meetings. I think then they go to Alaska to meet with the Chinese for a summit there. North Korea was not thrilled about their visit or the decision to proceed with a scaled-down version of joint U.S.-South Korean military exercises later this spring. In response, Kim Jong-un's sister put out a classic North Korean statement. Here's a bit of it. We take this opportunity to warn the new U.S. administration trying hard to give off a powder smell in our land. If it wants to sleep in peace in the coming 4 years, it had better refrain from causing a stink at its first step. They are about to bring a biting wind, not warm wind expected by all, in the spring days of March. I mean, Ben, that's the good shit right there.
I admire the dedication to the metaphor or whatever you want to call it, the smell analogy. Very, very, very consistently drawn.
Yeah. Look, it works. It's good stuff. So look, the good news is North Korea hasn't launched more ballistic missiles. They haven't conducted another nuclear test. The bad news is that North Korea continues to build and now conceal, based on some new satellite imagery, we've seen that they're starting to conceal places where we think they're hiding their nuclear stockpile. So look, this whole policy area feels like Groundhog Day to me, right? Like same problems, same people, same, conversations with the same allies. How do you think the U.S. can break this cycle here with North Korea so that we've avoided another 4 years of stern statements from the U.S., sanctions that result in, that hurt the people of North Korea, but at the end of the day, the North has more nukes and more missiles. Trump's diplomacy, it failed miserably, but at least he tried something new. Do you have a pitch for them here on a path forward?
Yeah, I actually think that, recognizing that nobody has succeeded at this and everything, therefore, is a long shot. I think the path forward is to try to get small steps in the right direction. For a long time, under Clinton, Bush, Obama, it was like, we don't accept North Korea having nuclear weapons, and that's the right thing. You don't want to accept that. They cheated their way to get them. But that was getting us nowhere. And then Trump tries this kind of big bang approach, right, where we're going to make friends with them, but that didn't get us anywhere either. I think just kind of like very intricate, hard-headed diplomacy that works with South Korea hand in glove, that doesn't acknowledge the legitimacy of the North's nuclear weapons, but just does say that, while our goal is, denuclearizing the Korean Peninsula, can we have small reversals of North Korea's program in certain areas in exchange for certain kinds of sanction relief, just to kind of start moving this in the right direction. And to stop the kind of the more nuclear weapons they have, the greater the proliferation risk, the greater the risk that they can put it on an ICBM that could reach the U.S., right, which is a huge security interest for us. So I'd like to see them try to pursue diplomacy that just at least tries to claw back in the right direction of certain parts of their North Korean program moving in reverse instead of moving inexorably forward here. The one thing I'd noticed, and some other people noticed this, is that the Biden people were using the phrase the denuclearization of North Korea when they were speaking publicly about what they wanted. It was unusual because, the formulation that, you put your name on a bunch of times, and me too, has always been the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula.
Right.
So it's a more hawkish frame. And obviously we don't support South Korea getting nuclear weapons, so I don't know exactly what accounts for it. But again, it may be they're trying to reassure the South Koreans and Japan, but a lot of things in the early Biden team, it's a pretty hawkish. I'd like to hear them explain why the change, I guess, because it's something that just a whole bunch of people like me noticed without much explanation.
Yeah, also not a topic where little phrasing changes like that go unnoticed or don't have a lot of meaning. One loop worth closing here, Ben, is you and I talked a million times about how Trump would try to threaten and bully allies like South Korea to pay us more. The U.S. to pay the U.S. more to cover the cost of U.S. military presences in places like the Korean Peninsula. And it got really ugly. There was one point Trump reportedly demanded that South Korea pay the U.S. up to 5 times the amount we were getting paid for our troop installation in South Korea. It's like 27,500 troops, I think. But over the weekend, the U.S. and South Korea cut a 5-year deal that will increase payments next year by 14% above the deals Trump negotiated in 2019 in 2020. So I guess Biden read Art of the Deal also, and it said, don't be an asshole to your allies and you will get a better outcome. So
yeah, it just shows sometimes in life, particularly with your friends, right? Being an asshole to your friend usually doesn't get you as far as being nice to your friend. I think more broadly, like the success of this trip, right, is that this is not subtle. It's like the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense going together on the first overseas trip, which normally would be to Europe or to North America, to South Korea and Japan, who are both allies who were treated poorly, to say the least, under Trump, but also obviously a critical part of any long-term U.S. strategy towards Asia or towards China, right, in terms of countering China, containing China's ambitions to some extent. So they're not being subtle in the prioritization of the Asia Pacific and the prioritization of democratic allies. And I think that's to the good. And look, this isn't a new idea. Like the Obama, administration famously, pivoted to Asia, rebalanced Asia. But I think people should take note that they're planting a flag in Asia, first of all, and in South Korea and Japan specifically. And that message won't be lost on the Chinese. I imagine China is even more so the audience that's intended versus North Korea, even if North Korea smelled something.
Well, so, and you flagged this. So one other flag that's being planted is, so the U.S. And Chinese officials are going to meet on Thursday in Alaska. According to Politico, one of the top agenda items is Taiwan. U.S. military officials are reportedly just increasingly concerned that China might invade Taiwan and create a new, pressure point for the U.S. to respond to something militarily. Taiwanese officials were understandably concerned during the Trump administration and about his commitment to their security when he reportedly told a Republican senator back in 2019, Taiwan is like 2 feet from China. We are 8,000 miles away. If they evade, there isn't a fucking thing we can do about it, end quote. Ben, is he wrong? Like, what do you think Biden's team can or should do to show their commitment to Taiwan security, to brush China back a bit? Is that possible at this point?
I think this is a huge issue that the world's going to have to watch very carefully, because there are very few places where there could be a real large-scale conventional war in the world, and Taiwan is one of them, right? And why do I say that? Like, first of all, the Taiwanese were always split between, wanting to have closer ties to mainland China and wanting to potentially be independent. The Hong Kong protest, I think, changed this whole calculation, because the people in Taiwan saw Hong Kong just get swallowed up, right? And the promise that Hong Kong got was one country, two systems. Well, that would be the promise under which Taiwan would come into a union with the People's Republic of China. And who's going to take that deal after watching what happened in Hong Kong? So there's an increasing likelihood that Taiwan could move in the direction of independence. You have an increasingly assertive, if not belligerent, leader in China, in Xi Jinping, building up his military. You have a U.S. which has longstanding defense ties with Taiwan. It's not a security guarantee, but there's been this kind of implicit, unspoken thing that, we are fortifying them. We sell them arms. We have defense relations because
grave concern. Yeah,
we don't want them to be invaded and taken over by China. And so this bears watching. And when I saw that, it's not usual for U.S. officials to kind of background that we're worried about an invasion of Taiwan. I didn't necessarily think that means that invasion is imminent. I took it more as the U.S. and the Biden team kind of signaling, hey, we're worried about this generally. The issue of Taiwan is going to be, we're going to these talks with the Chinese. Like, this issue of Taiwan is going to be more prevalent and prominent and more of probably a source of tension in our relationship. And so that I think bears real watching here.
Yeah. Let's turn to Uganda and just do a quick update because a couple weeks back, we were lucky to have a guy named Bobby Wine on the show. He is a 39-year-old Ugandan musician turned politician who's the leader of the Ugandan opposition movement. Bobby Wine and a lot of the country, the citizens of Uganda, are frustrated with President Museveni, who is beginning his sixth term as the president of Uganda, comes after several disputed elections. Frankly, he's the leader of a military dictatorship at this point. On Monday, Bobby Wine said that he and several members of parliament and some activists attended or led a protests against, quote, the abduction, torture, and murder of his supporters, end quote. And of course, they were arrested protesting the arrest of their supporters. So the good news is that Bobby Wine and those with him at this protest on Monday were released, but hundreds of Ugandans are being held in military detention. So I just wanted to flag this story for listeners because, very notably in our interview, Bobby was clear that one of the things he thinks keeps him safe is continued international media attention to Uganda and to his story. So flagging that one for everybody.
Yeah, no, keep an eye on it. And like, these people are showing enormous courage. And look, and this will apply to, Myanmar, if we talk about that, like some of these movements don't succeed the first time around, but if you look at this, if you look at how old Museveni is, and how old Bobby Wine is, and how old Bobby Wine's supporters are, they're fighting for democracy right now. Hopefully they win it, but they're laying the groundwork to win the fight at some point, Yeah. And you would like to see Bobby Wine stay free in that struggle.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, Ben, I've been reading about the protests in Myanmar from over the weekend. There's some really scary reports that half a dozen people at least were just murdered by the police and by military forces in response. Is there anything you're seeing sort of jump out of the situation there? Anything hopeful, anything dire, anything the U.S. government should be doing?
Well, the hopeful thing is this civil disobedience movement is much broader and deeper than anything we've seen in Myanmar to date. And it's not just support for Aung San Suu Kyi. It is that next generation of people getting involved, like we've talked about. The tragic news is that the military has clearly calculated that they're pivoting to full crackdown, and they're using live fire ammunition to break up protests. They're killing dozens of people and hoping that sends a message. It's not worth protesting because you might get shot. I'll say anecdotally, Tommy, I have friends in Myanmar, many of whom are activists, who, were protesting for the first few weeks. Some still are, but increasingly I'm hearing from them, I'm getting visited by the security services.
Oh, no.
The security services are outside my door. You can kind of feel that, the walls closing in, if you will, on this movement. And as with Bobby Wine, like you said, like they care about the world. watch any image of a protest in Myanmar and you see English signs.
Yeah.
That's not because they all speak English. That's because the audience is the international media and the rest of the world. And they find solidarity and motivation in that support. But they also feel like the only potential accountability for the military through international justice, through international sanctions, through international pressure is from that attention. So I think the U.S. just needs to stay focused on it, not drift. And one of the things I'd like to see, you ask concretely, when they sit down with China, that this be on the agenda. Because I think the Chinese are tacitly supporting what the Burmese military is doing. We tend to not raise this, it's far down the list of other things. But I think if we care about human rights, we should be, pressuring the Chinese about this, because the Chinese have a lot of economic interest in Myanmar. And by the way, the case I'd make to them is that if this entire place just implodes and collapses because the economy collapses and there's like a de facto civil war, it's not in anybody's interest either.
No, it's not. So speaking of solidarity for protest movements and protesters, let's talk about two very important debates that are happening right now about women's rights and women's safety. The first is in the UK, where last month a 33-year-old woman named Sarah Everard was abducted and murdered by an off-duty police officer. And it sparked this broader conversation about women's safety in Britain. Sarah was just walking home at like 9 o'clock at night to her flat in London when she was taken. And it was just this horrifying story. And over the weekend, there was a vigil for Everard in London, and people around the world were horrified and furious when images started to emerge of police arresting these women who are just attending a vigil. And then on Monday, the British Parliament started debating legislation that could mandate prison sentences of up to 10 years for protesters. So that's fucked. And then in Australia, last month, a woman named Brittany Higgins came forward to tell her story about being raped by a colleague inside Australia's Parliament building when she was serving as an aide to the Australian Defence Minister. That sparked a conversation in Australia about misogyny in government, specifically in Prime Minister Scott Morrison's Conservative coalition, and really shockingly high levels of sexual assault in Australia writ large. So Ben, again, in this situation, it is so frustrating and infuriating to see governments failing these women, often compounding the problem, often so far behind in like not advancing solutions, but making it harder for people to fight for their rights. So I wanted to raise these two stories and, basically just show solidarity from, the show to people in the streets who are protesting.
Yeah, and everybody should check out the videos of the British police breaking up that vigil, because it's like totally horrifying.
What are you thinking?
Just kind of young women peacefully protesting violence against women,
by a cop.
I think and just to reiterate your solidarity point, I mean, we've seen in this country, right, when Black Lives Matter started, it was treated as kind of a fringe movement in some ways, and it failed in some ways and succeeded in others. It succeeded in getting like a wholesale reckoning for the Ferguson Police Department, right? But it failed in some of its other objectives. But over time, because that movement sustained itself, now a lot of its positions are mainstreamed, and they've shifted the discourse on these things. And hopefully Joe Biden is signing serious police reforms that will still not be enough to a lot of activists who are pushing. And I think the message there is, if you have this kind of global solidarity among different movements, and those movements are sustained, you may not see the results you want in the British Parliament today, but you're much more likely to see them in 3 years or 5 years. So these are long-term fights. And we shouldn't be deterred by short-term setbacks or short-term kind of horrible images. Those should resolve us to kind of connect these movements around the world and carry them forward.
Yeah, and in fact, sometimes those short-term setbacks, like the images of the cops breaking up that vigil, can spark a huge advance. So let's hope that's what happened here. Two more issues. This one, is something you're hearing about a lot lately, which is the number of migrants arriving at the southern border. So that number has drastically increased, especially unaccompanied minor children. It's been increasing since last year. And at this point, the number of individuals arriving is starting to overwhelm the government's capacity to safely house these individuals, especially the children, during a pandemic. By law, the U.S. government has 72 hours to move unaccompanied minors out of Customs and Border Protection facilities into foster homes or the custody of a vetted sponsor, like a family member. But that's not always happening because they're overwhelmed, seemingly. Biden's team is scrambling to do a bunch of stuff. They're trying to open up beds. They're trying to increase their capacity to house these kids. They're also trying to unwind Trump's immigration policies while also simultaneously sending a message internationally that is designed to dissuade migrants from traveling north in this moment. So that's obviously very, very complicated and hard to do all at once. Republicans have already started blaming Biden for the influx of asylum seekers. That insufferable moron, Kevin McCarthy, the congressman from California. Do you see him at the border? He did the thing they always do, which is they claim that terrorists are crossing into the country, even though there's literally no evidence that's ever happened, right? And McCarthy said people are coming from Yemen, Iran, and Sri Lanka. I believe he meant Sri Lanka, which is a country and not a dude named Mr. Lanka.
Just proving that he's also an idiot, you know.
Yeah, but look, correct me if I'm wrong. Maybe it's Mr. Lanka. So look, Democrats are pushing Biden to move faster, understandably. But Ben, last week, Biden's White House coordinator for the southern border, Roberta Jacobson, a really accomplished diplomat, outlined this plan to provide $4 billion in aid to Central American countries that will also agree to fight corruption. The idea being make life better in El Salvador, Honduras, et cetera, so that people don't want to leave those countries. But that approach is a long game approach. What do you think Biden should do here, right? Because he's getting pushed to acknowledge that this is quote unquote a crisis, which feels like a bit of a political trap because I don't know that policy solutions exist to solve the problem at crisis speed, like whether or not you acknowledge it. But what do you think you should do?
Yeah, I think that the political discourse around this is particularly dumb. I mean, because it's treated as like this, like Washington, whose fault is it? Who gets credit? Or what is Kevin McCarthy gonna with the midterm elections, right? Which aren't for a year and a half. And I get that that's why it's covered, but like this is like a really complicated, policy challenge with enormous human elements at stake here. And at the end of the day, they're going to have to align a whole bunch of pieces, right? What is the support that we're providing in terms of assistance to Central America that might improve circumstances there so there's not these kinds of flows? What is, very importantly, the messaging that we are doing in Central America to kind of warn people off these smuggling networks and to make clear to them that just arriving at the border is not a guarantee that you're going to get into the United States? What are the facilities that are available to particularly unaccompanied children that reach the border? How do we speed up the asylum process so that we can adjudicate claims more effectively? Like, I'm sympathetic to the administration here that solving that complex piece of business. Oh, by the way, when you're also trying to untangle all these Trump era regulations, that's going to take some time. I think, though, to give themselves that time, they're probably going to have to speak more clearly about what the whole end game is here in the coming weeks. They have to tell people this is where we're trying to get to. This is going to be the different elements of our policy and how they fit together. Because right now there's a bit of a vacuum in kind of understanding what they're aiming for, and that's allowing the Kevin McCarthys of the world to turn this into some DC political competition of narratives, which it's always going to have a component of that, but so for me, if you're in a circumstance, and this, Tom, Ben, as well as me, like if you're not done yet in cooking the policy, sometimes you have to buy yourself time by telling people what the end result is going to be, and I think that's the solution here.
Man, the reporters pressing Jen on whether it's a crisis just reminded me of all the times we were told to say radical Islamic terror, or these lexical definitions around word choice that mean nothing ultimately. It's like, look, Jen saying crisis doesn't change what's happening.
And by the way, the reason it's not a crisis is this happens periodically at the border. This, unfortunately, the tragedy is it's not totally, I mean, the numbers
it's
are
like an annual
high.
Thing.
Yeah, the numbers go up a lot. And I'll tell you, we've underfunded a lot of things. We don't have enough money for asylum judges to process the claims, right? Like we don't have enough money to figure out, how to house people in a humane way. In part because we've been pouring all this money into border security and enforcement, including under the Obama years. And so there's a lot more money in the government that goes towards that than goes towards dealing with the human beings who are affected by this. So hopefully they can change that. But that's in their, that takes budgets too. This takes time, Yeah,
it's going to take some time. Okay, last segment is, look, I teased it. It's an evergreen segment called Why Tucker Carlson is a Dick. I guess we could do this 5 days a week. So last week on his show, Tucker put up a photo of a U.S. military flight suit designed for pregnant women. By the way, it was designed during the Trump administration. And then he went on some rants about how the U.S. military is getting more feminine and about how gender roles are being erased. You know, like this is the new Republican thing, right? To just complain about gender. The response was swift and it was brutal on Tucker. Countless members of the military took to social media to let him know that he's a moron. Women from all branches of the military posted about how they have served in combat zones and they've raised families at the same time. Senator Tammy Duckworth of Illinois, herself a wounded combat veteran, I think put it most succinctly when she tweeted, "Fuck Tucker Carlson." While he was practicing his two-step, America's female warriors were hunting down al-Qaeda, improving the strength of America's women, end quote. And she included a quick video of Tucker in like a frilly shirt, like clicking his fingers when he was on Dancing with the Stars. So, you know, not the best look for Tucker. Anyway, it's fun to see Tucker get roasted, right? I actually think he inadvertently kicked off a good and important conversation about the critical role that women play in the U.S. military. We should be talking about the great work that women do in the U.S. military more. More generally, Ben, tell me if I'm overthinking this. I do worry that, like, over the last few months, with Trump gone from Twitter and social media generally, Tucker has become the troller in chief. Yeah. Right? There's a whole group of well-meaning, good people who like capture, share, and amplify almost everything Tucker does every night, which is exactly what he wants to happen. He wants outrage ratings, right? He wants libs mad at him. I don't know that this is a worldo problem as much as me spending too much time on Twitter and worried about disinformation and right-wing propaganda getting amplified problem. But, you know, it is something I think about a lot.
No, Tucker Carlson, Sean Hannity is this kind of buffoonish guy who just takes his cues from other people, really. Like Tucker Carlson, there's a malevolence there that is alarming. And I guess the worldo angle that occurred to me when I saw General Austin and the DOD respond so swiftly, yes, it's an important opportunity for them to highlight the tens of thousands of women who served in the U.S. military since 9/11, you know, in increasing roles, including in combat. And we lifted restrictions on women in combat in the Obama administration, the increasing leadership role that women play, including the 2 4-stars that we talked about. But I think they responded swiftly too, because Tucker's messing with the cohesion of the military. I mean, let's be honest here. Like, I've traveled to a lot of military bases. Guess what news station is usually on in U.S. military? It's Fox News, right? Yeah. They're clearly, you know, probably mostly white men in the U.S. military who kind of agree with Tucker Carlson. And when he stirs the pot like this, he's literally probably causing, you know, lack of cohesion in like units and stuff. You know, people deployed in places like Afghanistan. And for the military to react like this, it tells me that they were worried. And look, they themselves have said they also think they have an extremism problem in the military. Why wouldn't they? Like the rest of America does. So he's playing with real fire here, right? By just taking his culture war into the institution that fights real wars and stirring that pot. You know, that's going to cause problems down to like the unit level here, because, you know, you're going to have some women in a unit and some Tucker, you know, viewers in the unit. And it's good that the military knocked that garbage down. I'd like to see them keep doing that. They can't help being in the circumstance of an America that is dealing with this nonsense. And so they should stand up for what's right.
Tucker, we all need to be a little more worried about Tucker.
I think so. I think you're right.
He's not just he's a smart guy. He's a very good writer, right? He's intelligent enough for this to not be just an act. It is malevolent. He's a real demagogue. He worries me a lot. I worry about him running for office, frankly. Donald Trump has showed us that there's no real limit in terms of what a demagogue can do in this country.
Yeah, and look, you know, we've joked, right, about how Tom Cotton and Mike Pompeo, like, you know, they have no charisma. So why would they be able to pick up the Trumpist mantle? But like Tucker Carlson has some charisma, and he's no dummy.
And a platform.
And he's got the biggest platform in cable news, except, you know, and so, you know, this is not just a joke, you know, like I share your worry about this sometimes.
Yeah.